What's up, everybody? Brian Wilson here, Life Unraveled podcast, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is boxing. I'm doing sort of a series of talks on this. This is going to be a history unraveled, so I'm going to kind of take sort of an approach I take anytime I've been doing or preparing a history podcast. Okay, so I'm also planning on putting out a more just free-form sort of vlog, plan on sharing it in the Sports Unraveled podcast and also on my Martial Arts Academy YouTube page, Força Martial Arts and Fitness Russellville. So you can check that out. It's going to talk sort of about differences in Eastern and Western boxing. Okay, so this podcast is going to talk about what is Western boxing, right? So before you can listen to this one about Eastern and Western boxing, probably a good idea to listen to this one. And I doubt right now I'll be doing one on what is Eastern boxing, but I plan on sort of going into that in this other sort of free-form talk I give later. So what is Western boxing? It's a great question. You hear it all the time. I've heard it ever since I've began training martial arts. I've been training martial arts at this time in 2019 for about 13 years. So it's interesting. A lot of people in the martial arts world don't consider boxing a martial art. I personally do. If you know anything about martial art, it means art of war. Essentially, it's a nod to war gods. For example, Mars is the war god in the Roman period. Ares would be the war god in the Greek period, and so on. So we see war gods in a lot of ancient cultures, is my point. But I, for example, teach courses on Western civilization. A lot of universities offer a course on world civilization, which you go way more into the East. And I think I prefer a world history approach, although I will say I enjoy teaching Western Civ because it allows me to focus more intensely on certain cultures I personally really enjoy, like Egypt and others, right? Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, stuff like that. But if you know anything about Western Civ, you know that's kind of it's the lens we use to talk about the traditions that we inherit or trace back to, the United States, Western Europe, stuff like that, right? So, for example, we wrapped up today talking about the rise and spread of Christianity, and how it relates to the West. Some other examples would be when I lecture on Greece and Rome, which I'm going to talk about heavily in this conversation. When I reference the Greeks, we're talking about their democracy and their assembly and their different political institutions and how they're relevant to us. Same thing when I talk about the Roman Republic. I also joke the United States chose to employ two systems from the ancient world that failed. But whatever. It's just a joke. But here's the thing. Boxing is more heavily associated with the West. We see it in a lot of Western cultures, but it's in the East. It's just different. And again, we're not getting into Eastern boxing really in this podcast, but I'm going to mention some of the cultures that we see a lot of prominence in boxing existing in. Okay, so it's heavily documented throughout the entire ancient world, from the Sumerians to the Romans, right? Sumerians being sort of that older culture, Mesopotamian culture, along with the Egyptians, that are some of the oldest peoples we know anything about, right? So, and those are the first two cultures I hit in my Western civilization class, for example. But also the Egyptians, the Assyrians, right? The Neo-Babylonians, or Babylonians in general, which are Mesopotamians, the Hittites. These are all cultures that have depictions of boxing in either paintings, on pottery, reliefs, on temple walls, and stuff like that, right? in the Greco-Roman world. Like, that's what I'm going to focus on mostly in this podcast today, right? And real quick, I should have probably said this earlier. A little bit of my info I got from this book, Martial Arts of the World, an encyclopedia. It's a 2-volume work. I cited it in my master's thesis. It's by an author, or an editor rather, and author, Thomas A. Green. He's done some articles, and this is a book that at the time I was doing my master's thesis, I couldn't even afford it, and I've since made it, and now I can afford to buy books, which were too expensive. I was always buying textbooks at the time. Anymore, I'm always trying to listen to audiobooks. That's how I learn the best. Probably why I'm into podcasting, if you want to be honest about it. So the thing here with this work, it's just an encyclopedia. It just overviews a lot of different martial arts all throughout the world. But it gives a real general information overview on things like boxing and different martial arts styles in the East and the West and so on. And it's typical. It's set up like a typical encyclopedia. So it's a good source. I've used it. I like pulling it off the shelf. I enjoy owning it now. I get to pull it off and sort of reference or look up and always getting new information from the pages. So that's that. But in the Greco-Roman world, we know that these pugilists, which is a Latin word, they developed the arts further than it had been seen. I would like to point out that while we see the Egyptians and others boxing, a lot of times it is actually they're doing like a mixed martial art. It's like not are they only boxing, but they might be using throws. We see stick fighting in ancient Greece, or I'm sorry, ancient Egypt. And so we see a lot of these. They're engaged in boxing, but you might see another depiction of them doing a throw or some sort of other, what we just call them, phase or range of martial arts, right? Like, so if you're standing far away, you're kicking them, you're a little closer, you're punching them, you're a little closer, you're trapping and grabbing them and clinching them and then trying to get it down on the ground. And we see all of that in a lot of these cultures, right? But the Greeks, we see representations with them in their earliest cultures. So when I first start talking about the Greeks, I talk about two early cultures, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, right? Minoans, this is a culture that exists on the island of Crete. Okay, we think that they are taken over by the Mycenaeans. These are Greek speakers. Minoans, we know, are learning more and more about due to excavations, archaeological excavations, and the Mycenaeans we know a fair amount about due to also archaeological excavations, but as well as Homer's poetry is paying homage to the Mycenaean period. So these are the earliest European cultures that I talk about in my class, like Egypt being not on that continent, and then you go over across the way to Mesopotamia. We're in Asia, so it's interesting to look at these earlier cultures already having boxing being depicted. So, like when I get to the Greeks and I start in my Western civilization course, when we start talking about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, it's like, hey, these are the first two European cultures that we've mentioned in the class. So, and then the previous cultures that we get into that we know the most about would be the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, stuff like that. And we see boxing in those cultures too. So there are ties and traditions associated quite heavily with the West, right? Not exploring all those ties on this podcast, but just sort of highlighting some of the connections and how and where they exist. So we see the first famous Greek boxer is a man named Theogenes of Theos, right? And he is depicted as being the champion of the Olympic Games in 450 BC. Said to have won over 1,400 contests, killing most of his opponents. right? And here I like talking about this guy, possibly a mythological boxer, right? But a guy named Melanchomus, Melankomas. He's from Caria. And he fought in the Olympic Games later, 49 AB, winning for that game. And he is legendary for this. All right, and I actually found out about this guy from a podcast guest I had on from the Life Unraveled series. But he is legendary for this. He never delivered nor received a blow in a contest, and he was undefeated in an unbeaten record. There's a lot of scholarly debate on both sides of whether or not he's mythological and existed, or was this historian who writes, one of the historians who gives an account of him, is sort of depicting him as the ideal man, the ideal athlete, right? And what we know about Melanchomus comes from Dio, is just call him Dio for our purposes here. And he tells us Melanchomus is able to do things like hold his guard up for 2 days straight. Once boxed one of his opponents for an entire day. But he would, I guess you could say he would stall. Might be a good way of describing it in today's terms. Or he would just, without actually throwing punches, outbox people. He would get them to swing and miss. They would tire, and he would be the victor of the day. Sometimes that was an entire day. But that is sort of a little bit of a survey of boxing in the Greek world. It's a key part of their culture. It's something that they do for entertainment, and this is something I bring up to my classes. If you look at Greek culture and Roman culture as well, but just being, what rises up next is you see the importance of competing. And I think this is where in the West we get a lot of our traditions associated with sport, right? For example, for the Greeks, for like the Athenians and the Spartans, that athletics means to win prizes. To be an athlete is to compete and win a prize. They didn't just like it because it was fun, or like it because they enjoyed it and had a good time. What they liked was the competition, right? So if you've ever played a game of like regular Monopoly, which Monopoly Empire is a much better, faster version of that game, I enjoy it. And it's competitive too, don't get me wrong. But if you've ever played a game of Monopoly, you know that, my cousin and I, we used to get in like knockdown, drag out, heated, yelling arguments and shouting festivals over who was winning the current game of NCAA 2004 for PlayStation 2. Right? But basically what I'm saying is these Greeks particularly were competitive. They liked to win prizes. They liked the resilience and the pride that came with competing, right? So we see that as a central, it kind of makes sense if you know that, okay, that's why they developed the Olympic Games. That's a central part of their culture across the board. It makes a lot more sense that boxing obviously fits into that mold, right? Let's see here. We see the Greeks wearing bindings on their hands. They would twist the bindings to make them inflict more damage on the faces of their opponents. These are eventually replaced with a more leather form of a glove, a more rounded out form of a glove. And we also see ancient boxers in the Greek culture, but also in the Egyptians, wearing sort of a headgear or a helmet. And we see this depicted in the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, and wearing a very similar headgear to these Greco-Roman boxers that are wearing headgear, right? So, just interesting to see cross-cultural ties, and also interested to see if it was bare knuckle or did they have gloves or what have you. I'm sort of fascinated by if you ever seen any like Jeet Kune Do era gloves. Like they're sort of the forefather of the mixed martial arts glove that is used currently, being the sort of the martial sport that is hot right now. Like in the West, it's on ESPN. It's like if you're coming on ESPN, I'm just going to call you a national sport, right? Or an international sport. It's like I always just tell people, I'm like, yes, if you turn on ESPN, you're going to watch mixed martial arts and some in boxing and other things right alongside basketball, baseball, football, and stuff like that, right? So it's a major sport to this day. So talking about the Romans real quick and kind of wrapping things up, boxing's a lot different in Roman times. It's sort of a gladiatorial spectator sport. Metal studs are instituted into the gloves, and often it's slaves fighting slaves who are put on display in these arenas, right? And maybe they would be chained, maybe, or there would be some sort of an obstruction of space, right? So when I was working with some of our boxers yesterday, I put some cones down and limited their space. Like, hey, you can only box in this square, okay? Well, the thing is like rings are a square now, typically. There's octagons and circles that, depending on what combat sport we're talking about, people fight in now. But this is actually where we get the term or the idea of the ring, right? They would draw a circle or, depict a circle somehow on the floor of the arena, the amphitheater, wherever the contest was taking place. And that's where we get the idea of the boxing ring, right? It was a circle, not a square. And again, it was often slaves who provided this entertainment. And this is the sort of entertainment and spectator version of the Roman sport of boxing. So it takes on a different form. Much more, I would just say, the way I read it, and I think it's because they eventually started using combining with weapons or just like putting the metal stud in their glove and stuff like that, that it was a lot more violent. That's just kind of my takeaway. But if you survey things happening like the invention and introduction of heavy armor into European society, of firearms into the West, into European culture, this sort of is seen as a reason, and I'm just repeating the thesis of other people here, but and I'm like, it makes sense to me. So this is sort of a reason that boxing experienced sort of a cultural downturn in the West until its reemergence in the 1700s. That's when boxing sort of makes a rebound. And if you look at boxing today in 2019, it's there are a few fights a year that you want to see. There's Vasily Lomachenko out there. On my way in from the university today, I was reading Manny Pacquiao just fought this last weekend, and I was reading him and Floyd Mayweather talking shit to each other. It was quite humorous, but or back and forth on the internet. They were Mayweather's made some sort of post saying that Manny Pacquiao has only ever made any money through associating himself with his name. And then Pacquiao's like, dude, you came to the fight and you're talking about me on the internet. So who knows? They're probably in on it together, and that's what boxing is right now, right? So mixed martial artists like Conor McGregor fighting Floyd Mayweather. It's interesting to study, guys, how there are all of these rises and falls in the sport, and it's just fascinating to study in the ancient world. It's fascinating to study it at the pinnacle or the peak and throughout the Muhammad Ali era. I plan on doing several podcasts over boxing. I've done some boxing unraveled. So again, this is going to be a history unraveled. So check out, I've just done a few history unraveleds, but check that out. And also I've done some vlogs on the jab and some different boxing posts on our Força Martial Arts and Fitness YouTube. And check over there if you want to hear a follow-up talk on sort of my take on differences and similarities in Eastern and Western boxing styles. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening. It's been fun, just doing a little research. These are obviously passions and interests of mine, but I love sort of going down a rabbit hole and gathering info and being able to have an outlet to share. So again, appreciate all the support. If you don't mind sharing this over with some of your friends, that would be great. We're trying to grow our digital footprint, so to speak, and we can do that at a faster rate with people's help. So tell somebody you know about this, or subscribe to our channel, hit the bell so you can get notifications when we upload, or maybe share this over to some form of your social media. We appreciate it. Thanks.